Okay, boys and girls, today on review, we've got the Audio Research Reference 6SE Preamplifier. I hope you enjoy it. Audio Research is one of the storied, long-time, high-end brands in audio. When we started the Absolute Sound back in 1973, Audio Research had been around for a few years, and early on in the cycle, we covered their very famous preamp, the SP3A, and since then, Audio Research has been known as a top producer of preamplifiers and amplifiers as well, particularly those built around tube circuit topologies. It's hard to remember this for those of you who are relatively new to the sport, but there was a time in the early 70s and late 60s when the assumption was that transistors were going to rule the earth, tubes were the technology of yesteryear, and there were a few people like William Z. Johnson, who was the president of Audio Research, who said, wait a second, tubes have got some life in them, and there are some characteristics that tube devices have that transistors do not have, and those are desirable characteristics. So we're going to build a whole line of products around tube amplification devices. Anyway, that's sort of a very, very brief history. But my point is, Audio Research has been around for more than 50 years, making great products that have been highly reviewed by publications like ours. And we thought we would catch up with one of their more recent offerings and see how it worked and whether, we thought it lived up to our values. But before I go into sound quality, which is kind of what we're here to talk about, I do want to just briefly talk about what a preamplifier, or they would call this a line stage, because it does not contain a phono preamp. It does not contain RI double equalization and the gain stages needed for moving coil or moving magnet cartridges. So it's, in modern parlance, a line stage. But in the current world, there are all sorts of different architectures for ultimately driving speakers, and it may help some of you to just go back to basics and talk about what a line stage is. So a line stage, you could probably talk about this a lot of ways, but I think of it as having three functions. Function number one, and I think one that's often overlooked, but it's actually, for reasons I'll talk about at the end of this review, not something to be scoffed at, is that line stage is a switch. So the Ref 6SE has 8 inputs for our balanced XLR type inputs, for our single-ended RCA type inputs. So you can have 8 different devices connected up to line stage like this with lots of flexibility. And that's a great thing if you have multiple sources that you want to use and you want them to be easy to use. So for example, I have in the current reference system that I'm using, I have 2 different turntables and 3 different phono preamps. So I've got essentially 3 cartridge phono preamp combinations connected up to the Ref 6SE. That's one example. On top of that, I have, I have a good old-fashioned CD player, and I have 2 D to A converters that I'm running into it. So right there, and I don't have a tape deck, and I don't have a tuner, or there are other boxes that you might want to connect to this, but I'm using 6 of the 8 inputs on the Ref 6SE, and it's just very handy to be able to, In my case, I just punch a button on the remote to pick the correct input, and boom, it switches to that input, and I can listen to that phono cartridge or that CD or that DAC or streamer. So, it sounds obvious, but it's kind of handy, and there are more and more devices today that don't have that kind of input flexibility, and if you use a lot of different sources, it's a nice thing. So it's a switch. That's part one. Part two is it's an attenuator. You could say it's an amplifier because many line stages have the capability to have more than unity gain, and that's certainly a nice thing if you've got a low sensitivity power amplifier. So there may be some amplification, but in most cases, really what you're doing is you're taking the output of the D to A converter. The current reference system that I'm using uses the DCS Lena D to A converter, and that's got a 2-volt output, which would drive the power amps I'm using to full output. So what I have to do to adjust volume is I've got to choose the level of attenuation of that signal. And, in normal parlance, that's a volume control. So you've got a switch, a volume control, and then, sometimes important, you have impedance matching. You want to have your line stage have an output that's of an appropriate impedance so that it can successfully drive whatever power amplifiers or power amp you are using. So 3 basic functions: switch, attenuator, or volume control, and impedance matching. All very important potentially to have a system that actually works properly and has the flexibility to use the sources you want. Okay, that's what a line stage does. The Audio Research Ref 6 does that. It does have, as I alluded to before, a remote control. It's got complete front panel switching. It's, as concepts go, it's a fairly simple box. I'll be back in a minute to talk about sound quality, because sound quality with line stages is a tricky subject. Okay, back in the day, it was common to say something that I think is a useful thought here. And that is that we wanted our amplification devices to act like a straight wire with gain. What we meant was you wanted your line stage or your phono preamp or your power amplifier to just have gain and nothing else. No other form of distortion or alteration of the signal. It seems like a nice idea. It's not so easy to do, but that's kind of how we're thinking about what a line stage should do. It's a little bit tricky because line stages, as I've said, have been around in a version of the form we're talking about here for 50 years. So we're talking about a fairly mature technology, although we keep having new devices and new capabilities to remove noise and distortion. So, things do keep getting better and better, but we kind of wanted to do nothing. And part of the problem is with a really good line stage like the Audio Research Ref 6 SE, you're sometimes listening to something and not hearing it, and that's what you want. That's the ideal. So it makes these products somewhat trickier to review. However, I want to tell you a little bit about it's been more than 6 months that I've had the Ref 6 SE, and 2 things got revealed in that. Thing number 1 was I go through a fairly large number of products that are submitted for review. Most of them get reviewed, some of them do not get reviewed, but I've had a lot of different products in here in the 8 months or so that I've had the Ref 6 SE. And what was really interesting to me was about 4 or 5 months into it, I started realizing that every time I put something new in, a new power amplifier, a new cable, a new speaker, a new D to A converter, a new cartridge, a new turntable, I could almost immediately hear exactly what difference it made. All right, that maybe doesn't sound too startling. Those of you, especially with speakers, who have listened to speakers, you know, speaker A and speaker B almost always sound quite different, and distinguishing between speakers is not that hard. But when you get down to power amps, and sometimes when you get down to D to A converters or cables, yeah, there are times when you would think it wouldn't be that easy. And yet every product I've put in with the Audio Research Ref 6 SE in the circuit, boom, it was pretty much immediately obvious. That got me to thinking, hey, this line stage is at least as good as almost all the products that I'm putting into the circuit. And that is, I think, a high compliment and makes the Ref 6 SE a really workable device if you're using the kinds of products that I've been reviewing. Now, I've been concentrating on products in the $10,000 to $50,000 range, and the Ref 6 SE, for reference, is $19,500, so it's in that same price range. I don't really think price matters that much. It's just an indicator of where things fall within the industry and how much technology has been lavished on that class of product. But if you're dealing with a $100,000 to $200,000 system, or maybe even a $50,000 to $100,000 system, this is a perfectly appropriate preamp that I think, from my experience, because it just keeps revealing difference after difference after difference, is at least as good as the other kinds of products you might put into the circuit. And so that's quite a compliment. I did compare it to some lower priced preamps that I had around, and every time the Ref 6 SE was more revealing. I particularly heard a couple of places where I thought it was superior. The big one that I want to talk about is that in terms of sound staging, width and depth, and the ability to do layering and place instruments and voices in the right position front to back was superb. And that area of sound staging is something that really requires very low noise, and that's why, as I've had and found better and better equipment, it keeps revealing itself as sounding better, and it sounds better significantly on this dimension of sound staging and the details of the hall and accurate depth layering and the separation of instruments and spotlighting performers, all of those kinds of things. And the Ref 6 just went along for the ride, and I've come to think of that as a sine qua non of really good audio equipment these days, and the Ref 6 has that capability. Okay, so that's part one. The second thing that I realized after maybe 2 months that I really ended up liking about it was it didn't have the treble or transient hotness that you sometimes get with products that seem detailed and revealing and transparent, but then you realize tonally they aren't quite right, and they don't seem like live music. I've used the term before, the Ref 6 SE is not faking it, it's really transparent. And I found that made listening to music very enjoyable, and it wasn't distracting with some kind of artificial distortion. And I will say, just one reviewer's opinion, but 15 years ago, there was a lot of work being done in high-end audio that I think erred on the side of faking it a little bit. You just got some transient hotness that wasn't really right, and it was a little bit annoying, and you felt like you had to suffer a little bit to get that transparency that a lot of us really enjoy when we're actually listening to concerts. So I thought that transient naturalness was another wonderful element of the Ref 6 SE. Okay, now I'll say a third thing that I can't really be sure of because I haven't had the big CH Precision or a big Solution preamplifier in here, but I feel like the Ref 6 SE, if it is shaded at all, is shaded to be like 1%. That's a tiny amount in my lexicon. 1% soft. And I think that's actually, if you're going to have errors in any product, and that's the side to err on if you're going to err on it. It's barely there. I can't even really be sure of it. I just want to say it because I think that's, if there's any character to the Ref 6 SE, it's that teeny weeny little bit of softness, which again, when people listen, for example, to cartridges, they almost always choose a cartridge that's 5 or 8 or 10% soft. So I just want to put it in context. So a lot of people prefer movement in this direction. I just thought the Ref 6 SE was beautifully judged in terms of how it went about this particular kind of orientation, if you will, to how it presents the music. Okay, I'm going to be back in a minute to talk about another test I did, which was of a very different ilk than putting all of these components into the reference system over the last 8 months. And this one was quite revealing to me, so I think you'll want to stay tuned for this. Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. As you may know, I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of The Absolute Sound. We have a new product. It's on the Substack platform, and we're going to do some interesting things with Substack. First of which is reader questions and answers. Each Monday, readers will submit questions. We'll pick the most interesting ones and we'll answer the questions on Friday. We'll also have early access to articles and special blogs that don't appear anywhere else. We hope you'll join us. It's only a cost of a cup of coffee per month. Just check on the screen or in the show notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show. I got excited and I decided to pull the trigger on doing this review now. And as you probably can tell, it's a little bit hard to review products that are this close to the straight wire with gain world. But this week, I downloaded the firmware that takes the DCS Lena and installs a digital volume control. I also got the Lumen T3 DAC, and that also has a different implementation of a digital volume control. I thought to myself, hey, this is actually kind of an ideal scenario. I can take these two DACs with their digital volume controls enabled, and I can listen to them without a preamplifier. I mean, you can say they have a preamplifier in them, but they have that circuitry no matter what. All you're adding is the math process that makes the digital volume control work. Yes, let the food fight begin on whether digital volume controls add distortion or not. I'll leave that for my review of these two products. But let me say this, just as a summary, digital volume controls as implemented by D to A converter companies who really know what they're doing work quite well. So I thought to myself, hey, here's a good opportunity to, not exactly A-B, but kind of A-B, no preamp with a preamp, because if what I'm hearing, which is that on my reference gear, we'll come back to that too, but on my reference system, if what I'm hearing is I almost can't hear the Ref 6 SE, then I ought to be able to do a comparison of, let's say, the DCS Lena 1.1 run straight into my power amp, and the DCS Lena 1.1 run through the Ref 6 SE. I did that, and I'm here to tell you the differences are microscopic. If I had to say, there might be occasionally on certain recordings a slight benefit to the preamp being out of the circuit. But every time I thought I heard that, I then went back and listened again, and I realized, oh, I didn't really have the volume matching right, or, oh, when I heard this character of this song the second or the first time I played it, when I played it again with the preamp in the circuit, it sounded very, very close to identical. What I'm here to tell you is, if you're deeply bothered by the last 0.01% of performance, which, after all is part of what we're here to talk about, and if you don't need the switch function that I talked about before, you might look at these products that have digital volume controls. But the big message, I think, is at the level of line stage we're talking about with the Audio Research Ref 6 SE, you are giving up very close to nothing on the class of equipment that I'm using by having a line stage or a preamplifier in the circuit. And I think that's really good news, because for those of us who have significant investments in vinyl and in turntables and phono cartridges and phono preamps, you really need that switch functionality. And I like to use other sources as well. And so I kind of need the switch. And in general, the D to A converter companies who have built digital volume controls haven't really always put switches in their products. Some products do have switches, and that's kind of nice, although they're generally, I think, not as flexible as the Ref 6 SE. Anyway, I'm here to tell you, from what I could hear, the difference is so microscopic that you're being distracted by trying to listen for the difference rather than just enjoying the music, which you can do in either case. So I was really pleased with the results with the Ref 6 SE. Now, I do have to say, if we're going to talk about budgets, if you don't need the switch, if you don't have multiple inputs, if you just want to stream, let's say, you can save $19,500 by not having a preamp, and that money might be invested someplace else in your system, and that seems like a reasonable choice to me. So from an economic standpoint, having a preamp if you don't need it is kind of dumb. But other than that, if you do need the switch and you want it to be a really, really good and superb switch, I've got an excellent candidate for you, I believe. Okay, I'll be back in a second and we'll talk about the reference system, but I'm pretty much done with my comments on the Ref 6 SE itself. I'm going to talk about the reference system because you need to know the level of other equipment that I've tried here to come to these conclusions, because there's equipment well above the price range that I'm talking about that may be better and might reveal that the Ref 6 SE isn't up to the task of working with that kind of equipment. But anyway, I'll tell you about the reference system in a second. Okay, kind of an appendix. The reference system I have landed on going through 8 months or so with the Ref 6 SE is pretty straightforward. As I said, as a primary source for streaming and high res, which is kind of my default thing, I am using the DCS Lena 1.1 DAC with the master clock. So you can read the reviews of that. You can watch my YouTube video about that D to A converter. I think DCS does a very nice job. They have a special DAC topology that, in my experience, works extremely well. All right, so there's that. I also have 2 turntables. I'm using Technics SL1210G, and that has 2 different Hana moving coil cartridges, the Umami Blue and the ML. And those are being run into right now I'm running them into my Hagel V10 phono preamp. I also have a J. Sakura Initial Max turntable that has got 2 tone arms mounted on it, the J. Sakura Kevlar arm, and that has the DS Audio 003 run into the DS Audio preamp box. You need a special preamp for DS Audio optical cartridges. I also have a Kuzma 4.9-inch tone arm, and that's got a Benz Gullwing SLR cartridge, and that's running into a Musical Surroundings Phenomena 3 phono preamp. Okay, so that's my vinyl setup. Those are the sources that are going in. I mean, I do have a CD player, which I mostly use to play some legacy CDs that aren't available on streaming. So that's an Oppo CD player with ESS DACs in it. Okay, so that's the source end of things. And then from the Ref 6SE, when I've been using that, I go into PS Audio BHK 600 monoblocks. These are formally 600 watt per channel, but if you actually look at the specifications, they're 750 or 800 watt per channel amplifiers. And I have those amplifiers driving Magico A5 loudspeakers. So it's, in modern high-end terms, it's a mid-price system. Although when we got to calling $100,000 audio systems mid-priced, I can't really tell you, but here we are. I think it's very good. I've listened to lots of speakers that I've had in here, lots of power amplifiers, multiple preamps that I've compared to the Ref 6SE, other turntables, and multiple other D to A converters. And as I said, the punchline on the Ref 6SE is it reveals the differences between those things instantaneously without seeming to impose any readily identifiable sound on the operations. So, as you can tell, I've really enjoyed this product. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have, please click on the subscribe button. Please hit the notify bell. Of course, you're also invited to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and which actually comes out twice a week and keeps you abreast of happenings in the audio world. And of course, our flagship reviews and other commentary on both music and the audio scene appear in the Absolute Sound magazine, and we would love it if you would become a subscriber there. So thank you very much for watching.